Welcome to Om Times TV, a division of Om Times Media and Broadcasting. If you're looking for visionary conversations that push the boundaries of everything you thought you knew, welcome to Conversations Beyond the Cutting Edge, where every month, veteran broadcaster, author, and media consultant Sandie Sedgbeer invites two leading authorities from distinctly different fields to engage in a deep dialogue focusing on the latest discoveries, information, and insights on some of today's most provocative metaphysical topics. Here's your host, Sandie Sedgbeer.
Hello, and welcome to part one of this month's Conversations Beyond the Cutting Edge with transformational speaker, consciousness researcher, life coach, and best-selling author Cynthia Sue Larson, and sociologist, writer, researcher, and co-founder of World Shift International, Kingsley L. Dennis. And they're both with me today to share their latest research, revelations, and insights on consciousness, the nature of reality, simulation theory, quantum jumps, the Mandela Effect, the reprogramming and reorganization of human light, who's controlling how we think, and the burning questions. Where is humanity heading? Have we been tricked into perceiving a false reality? And who are we, really? Cynthia Sue Larson, Kingsley Dennis, welcome.
Thank you, Sandie.
Welcome,
Okay,
Sandie.
so
All the
good
big
to have you
questions.
both here. So to understand some of the deeper topics we will be covering in these two episodes, let's start by getting both of your individual takes on the nature of the current transition and how we got to where we are now.
That's all.
That's all. Yeah, that'll take up the first half. Cynthia Sue, let's start with you.
Well, okay. I've been looking at things through the lens of physics primarily and studying consciousness as it relates to all of reality. So when you ask a physicist how we got here, it's like asking a philosopher, and chances are, if they're deep thinkers, they'll say, why is there anything at all? So starting with that would be quite a long discussion. So I think what you really are getting at is more recently what's been happening.
Yeah.
And that's quite sociopolitical. And so it's not exactly my specialty. So I'm excited that Kingsley will be following me by providing his brilliant take.
Come on then, Kingsley. Tell us, what's your take?
Well, thank you, Cynthia. I mean, we correlate well because, as you say, you're looking at the physics and side of phenomena. Yes, I tend to look at the social side, but I tend to try to look at the bigger picture, not just the minute details. I mean, socially, politically, there's a lot going on. I mean, part of it is because, well, we're in a kind of social transition where we're going from a localized kind of network gathering communities into a global one, and we've been going that for a while because the way that our nation states and our cultures have been expanding across the globe now with communications. But of course, in the past, all civilizations, all cultures have always had a grand narrative, a narrative which sustains the culture, or you could say programs the culture or conditions it. It gives each culture and civilization a picture of their place in the cosmos, their place in the world, and their place in their localized communities. And we know that because we've gone through epochs where, perhaps they had a mythological understanding of where people saw themselves in the world. Then we had a cosmological understanding. We've had a religious understanding and a scientific understanding. But in each time, of course, each culture tries to maintain that narrative, that grand narrative. And because there's a certain movement going on where socially, politically, the governing, controlling factions or the social management factions, let's call them that, want to go to a global stage. There's this movement whereby they're trying to take localized narratives and upshift them to a grand global narrative, which incorporates most people, the majority of people. and you can call that globalization at one stage. They're trying to incorporate a lot of different diverse cultures and backgrounds and religious and political and spiritual and cultural beliefs into a grand narrative. But of course, that actually is a very, very difficult process to go from a localized to a global one. But at the same time, there's this groundswell, I say from the bottom up, of let's say, people's knowledge base is expanding through more information, more communication. So they're not actually, it's harder to maintain the consensus narrative. When you're moving to a globalized one, which is a huge agenda, and you've got people coming up and expanding their awareness and stepping back and saying, actually, this may not be the narrative that I wish to be involved in. So we're seeing, I think, what I call a breakdown or a collapse in the grand consensus narrative. And the top down are trying to strengthen that through certain strategies and tactics, which are being quite, in some cases, quite brutal. They're trying to, create this grand narrative, hold it in place as they transition globally. And then from the bottom up, there's a kind of lack of trust, lack of acceptance, and a greater awareness saying that actually these are narratives we don't align with my own personal inner evolutionary narratives or my own self. And so there's a kind of discontinuity or a desynchronization, I would say, between individuals and local groupings and the grand narrative. And therefore, that's one of them, why we live perhaps in a post-truth world, to use that often used phrase. So reality or the truth is no longer a grand narrative, it's collapsing. And this is part of the turmoil I think we find ourselves in.
I'm glad you mentioned the truth concept, because that brings back physics right away. Because there we go with this idea, this presumption for many years, actually centuries, that there's just one consensus narrative, that there's one truth, that there's an objective reality. And this is the foundation behind what we now know as our current cutting edge Western science, which stood on that pillar of objectivity. And that has been collapsing rather quietly in the background. But for physicists who are looking at these things, they'll notice that subjective reality seems to be much more the truth of the way reality actually operates. What does that mean? It means literally you can have an experiment where, I think we'll get into this later, but you can have two observers side by side seeing completely different things. And that's now part of our new science that doesn't fit neatly within the confines of what we've been taught, most of us in the last few hundred years. And so there's a big change happening, which I love the way you write about it, Kingsley, in your book, The Inversion, because you get into the way that there's this topsy-turvy quality going on, this sense that things have been pushed forward, maybe forcefully in some cases, that do not necessarily match what those of us studying the real objective, I'm calling it objective truth, the truth that we can all agree on. What if objectively we're saying that there is no such thing as true objectivity and our best observations will be made locally? Then what does the new global narrative look like then? And that's a question.
Can I just add to that you're always talking about reality, and you say, Kingsley, that reality is broken. But if there is no such thing as reality, how can it be broken?
Well, it's broken at this level. I mean, that's quite a crude statement, but it's trying to encapsulate a lot in a short phrase, that reality is broken. I often refer to our reality that we're sharing here as the lesser reality. And I suppose that goes along kind of Platonic lines, where Plato was saying there's a kind of grand reality out there, like, the allegory of the cave. And so there's a grander reality out there, the pure forms and ideals. But we are witnessing a kind of replica of that, or a lesser form of it, which we may get into also with themes of the simulation hypothesis. And so that lesser reality, or now we can call it the subjective reality, has been held together by these narratives. Because if everything is subjective, then it's a kind of participatory narrative. And I think it was the physicist Wheeler. You should correct me, Cynthia. Who said we live in a participatory universe.
Yes.
I'm not. I need to brush up on my quantum mechanics. So with that in mind, when I say reality is broken, I think I'm referring back to the consensus reality that we've been trying to get everyone to agree with, and now we're not in agreement, and there's a contestation over trying to agree what this subjective reality, how it should operate. And I think that's dominating a lot of the events we're seeing around the world.
And another thing to think about with this subjective concept is if you look at the delineation between the causal area where we can be at cause, which is something that both Kingsley's new book gets into, and so does mine, the Mandela Effect in its society, and the inversion. So both of these are looking at similar topics, really, looking at the way that this causal area, if we are pure consciousness, and if consciousness is primary, which a lot of physicists would agree with, including, I think, Wheeler, Einstein, lots of cutting edge physicists would be saying consciousness is primary. It's fundamental. You can't get behind it. Then there is this causal area. And that seems like the inversion seems to be the case where we're putting the effects ahead of it's like the cart before the horse, not really acknowledging that there's a whole causal realm and that we are able to implement changes to this causal realm through the realm of ideas.
I'm sure you're both familiar with Carl Kalleman. I know you are, Cynthia, because I've been reading about it in your book. But I've interviewed him many, many times, and he talks about the global mind, and he talks about the fact that the global mind is informing us, and we are constantly informing it. And he talks about the 9 waves of consciousness, and that we are now we have access to a wave of consciousness that is greater than what we've had before. But of course, we still have all the other waves as well. And that there's so many people seem to be having anomalous experiences. So many people seem to be talking about things they never would have, even thought about a couple of years ago. Is that what is creating all of that? Is that this, consensus is changing, and so everybody's feeling something?
Yeah, this could be considered having to do exactly with those 9 waves of creation, which have to do with the Mayan. It's mythology, but it's really their cosmology as well, that they were expecting that this time would be here, arriving after 2012. Some people say, well, nothing happened in 2012. You guys are wrong. But really, that was quite a bit did happen in 2012. And then it kicked off this whole wave of this 9th wave where things are just escalating and getting more and more novel, as Terence McKenna talked about, hyper novelty. And we're definitely seeing that. We're seeing that there's just so much change that you can't even keep up with it on the technological side. And that's it goes together with this underlying understanding that indigenous peoples have had, not just the Mayans, but most of the indigenous peoples. I was fortunate enough to be part of the inner circle of the Language of Spirit conference back when it was happening. They disbanded after 2012 because it looks like we're on our own now. It's like, okay, you guys, you can handle this. Off you go. You've got this. Okay, wonderful. But anyway, what we were hearing prior to that time was physicists, linguists, and indigenous elders were getting together in conversation, a very Bohemian dialogue, where we would talk about a topic and it would possibly seem to go in circles, but it would come around back to the original idea. And what I was hearing and learning is that listening deeply is part of what it means to be a Homo sapiens, a wise human, and that we all are wise humans fundamentally at our core. But this has been something we've forgotten. We've been told to look elsewhere. And so this time of great tumult that Carl Kalleman writes about with the 9th wave, that the indigenous people the world over have been expecting, we're in the thick of it right now. And so it's important that we pay attention to things like this idea that maybe there has been some sort of an inversion, that the things that we've been looking to and putting on pedestals might be a little bit off, and that there might be something much more to consider having to do with our true nature as Homo sapiens.
Kingsley, tell us a bit more about this inversion.
Well, again, it's like Cynthia said that, it's time for the cart to go before the horse. I think the poor horse needs a rest. And I do think also it's about the nature of physicality as well, because what we're talking about here is the nature between consciousness and or non-materiality and physicality, materiality. And the narrative for aeons, for a long time, has been that physicality is primary, and that consciousness in human beings, especially, is a byproduct of physicality. It's a byproduct from the complexity of our brain neuronal connections, which that is supposed to be the norm, but actually for me it's quite abnormal. Now I don't have proof, but my intuition for a long time has sensed that consciousness and consciousness energy or conscious energy is primary in this reality and in our universal cosmos, and physicality is kind of secondary. It kind of unfolds from that. So and of course physics understands that, because when you get down to the past the quarks and everything, you've got energy is primary. So the idea that the narrative that we live in a physical construct of physical reality, physical world, is very limiting. It's very limiting. It's very constraining, and also it's a mechanism that can keep people in a certain state, a limited state, because it puts limits on our cognitive abilities and our perceptions, because we're always thinking that we're physical first. And so it allows a large degree of social management. It also brings in the idea that perhaps there isn't a purpose or evolutionary vector or direction to human life, because physicality is like an accidental eruption on the back of a planet hurtling through dead space. It all sounds, this is the inversion, this knowledge based, which has been incorrectly, intentionally or incorrectly due to lack of knowledge, being seeded into our cultural, civilizational kind of knowledge base. Now, I don't know Callum's work about the 9 waves, but I would concur with that, because it seems that part of breaking out of this inversion, this trap of materiality, which I call the material fallacy, is that we're having access now to more degrees of consciousness. And I put it down like my analogies, for example, now if we watch a television, we know that television doesn't produce the program. It receives the program. It receives the broadcast. But the quality of the program depends upon the hardware of the television. So back in the day when we all had our small black and white TVs, the picture, doesn't matter how the picture was sent, we could only see it in black and white. If we had a black and white television today, we'd see high definition in black and white. Then we progressed to the vacuum tube televisions, and then high definition plasma televisions, and et cetera, et cetera. So the quality of the broadcast is because of the advance or the finer tuning of the television set, the hardware. To use an analogy, we can say the human being, the vessel of the body, and everything, the nervous system, the DNA, and scientists now have come out and said the DNA acts as like a fractal antenna in the electromagnetic field. So if we can comprehend that we are a receiving station, then according to how we fine tune our apparatus, our nervous system and our mind and our whole body, we can receive either a black and white program, a high definition program, or a plasma program. So we now have access to those different waves of consciousness, because I think we are retuning our ability to receive those broadcasts. And by doing that, we are then moving out of this inversion and seeing the world in much clearer out of the confines of these perceptual limits.
What is driving this kind of expansion, recalibration?
It's hard to say for sure, but I think, just to give a brief answer before I pass it to Cynthia, is that we're not just we live in many different environments. We live, of course, in terrestrial earthly environment, which is in a cosmic environment. And I think we're receiving energies on many different levels. So if there's a shift in solar radiation, if there's a shift in radiation from the cosmos, from gamma rays and plasma radiation, all these can affect the frequency of life on this planet and the human nervous system and can recalibrate. So that possibly could be some part of this retuning of receptivity on this planet. And we are going through a transition in many ways more than just social political, I think on a much planetary way. And I think there's all involving levels of different kind of recalibration of energies. And some of that is most likely going to have an electromagnetic effect on the human body's nervous system.
I don't know which one of you wants to answer this one, but I mean, Carl Kalleman would say then that, we are actually creating this change. We may not be aware of it. We may be unconscious, but we are participating in making that happen. A lot of other people will say things like, well, someone else is making it happen.
Right.
The ET's up there in their craft, or, the cabal, or, Illuminati or something. I mean, what's your take on that, Cynthia?
Yeah, this looks to me like it's clearly something that is collaborative with consciousness itself, that we as Homo sapiens, wise humans, we're collectively awakening. This is a great awakening, and this definitely ties in with Carl Kalleman's ninth wave concept. And right now, according to a lot of mythological traditions, we are moving, like the Hopi say, from the fourth world to the fifth. If you look at the fourth world, I think it's significant because they say the world has ended many times, that there's been a great flood, and so on and so forth. And clearly it looks like we're in epical times right now. And we need to rise to the occasion each time there's this sort of a challenge and recognize the truth of who we really are. And to me, the four dimensions of, three dimensions of space, one of time, that's an interesting synchronicity with the fourth world. Moving into the fifth, which would require then, one would expect, some sort of analogous growth phase, which could be uncomfortable for humans to move from 3 dimensions of space into 4. I'm bringing up this dimensionality concept because that's where we start to recognize, wait a minute, if we are capable of interacting with a higher level of conscious agency in a dimensional way that suddenly gives us access, for example, to instantaneous knowledge of something that's, some spatial distance away. And that is exactly what happens when you go from like flatland of 2 dimensions where you're just on a flat piece of paper. I'll have a Post-it here. So if you're on flatland, and I'm not in flatland, I can look down on flatland and see the floor plan, and I can see Mr. Circle hiding from Mr. Square. I know Mr. Circle's in the closet. How do I know all these things? Because I'm not on flatland. I'm 3 dimensions of space moving through time. And so I've got an advantage. The reason I bring this up is because then this whole matter of who is they, who are the programmers running the simulation, who are the dreamers having the dream. All of us are, but we need to claim those elements of dimensional conscious agency that some of us haven't really practiced with. We don't have that much experience with. And to me, it's clear that things like the Mandela Effect, where we notice history just changed. Nelson Mandela, didn't he die when he was incarcerated? People do remember that he died in 1987, but somehow he was alive again. And that's just one of many so-called Mandela effects, where the past looks like it's changing. These are indicators. And most of the young people now, the Generation Z, they know what the Mandela effect is. I just have to explain it to people over a certain age because it's not part of their language. They don't yet know it so implicitly. And we're going to see that the younger people are much more aware that reality shifts when consciousness changes the physical world. And that's absolutely true. So this is that cart and the horse situation again.
So, the Mandela effect, is this a sign, if you like, evidence of the fact that people are, their consciousness is changing, it's different, it's expanding, etc., and they're aware of so much more than they were before?
certainly presents that possibility. We're at the juncture right now where there's still controversy about what's causing the Mandela effect. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I can tell you what I suspect it is, but right now, people sometimes are pointing their fingers at CERN and the Large Hadron Collider, and I'm laughing. But there is a lot of energy in that device. So, is it possible that they could be experiencing some anomalous situations there? Absolutely. But when I look for evidence of the Mandela effect, I see that it goes back centuries, and therefore, I would recommend considering that as well. That yes, the technology can sometimes move us forward, but as Kingsley was referring to just a minute ago, that the material world, if you look for consciousness in the neurons, you're not going to find much there. If you look at it in the DNA, it's more likely that you'll find, as Kingsley mentioned, that the DNA represent antenna much more than they give all the instructions necessary to describe who Kingsley is. Could I clone a Kingsley? No, I don't think so. I wouldn't want to do such a thing, or a Sandie. No, unthinkable. You guys are completely unique, and I admire and respect you so much. And there's no way that some simple physiological process could possibly ever bring forth something as miraculous and magical and amazing and inspirational as the two of you are.
I've just been reading The Mandela Effect. I've read a lot about it in the past, but I've been reading your latest book. And, there are many people who are complaining right now, more than I've ever heard, of having memory issues. And, people will say, well, the Mandela Effect is just your poor memory. You think you heard something like that. And I don't know what's really happening with people's memories, but I do know that more people, including me, are having all kinds of, wipeouts of memory. Kingsley, have you had any experiences of the Mandela effect yourself?
Actually, no, not that I can pinpoint. I mean, misplacing keys and thinking they were somewhere else, or finding objects, but that's normal. But actually, I've never had an event where I could say that's changed my timeline or my understanding of the timeline. So, I mean, there's been glitches where I thought I had a different, I remember a book or a film differently, but nothing specifically where I say that is definitely shifted from my memory. So, so I have to be cautious and say I cannot be 100% sure that I have.
Mm. Well, and I'm really not sure what to make of the Mandela effect. I mean, I've had experiences where my sister, for example, would tell a story that actually happened to me, but she'd tell
Yes.
it as if it happened to her. And now I'm thinking, well, did it happen to me? Maybe it didn't happen to her, So the whole memory thing becomes very loose in those situations.
That's a great example, because when we talk to someone that knew us many years ago, that's frequently a time that these mismatched memories pop up. And so there's like a misalignment. So your idea of what historical facts are is quite different from someone else. And so that's a great intro to the Mandela effect. It's such a personal change.
Isn't it also true that when we hear something enough, sometimes we take it on as a memory, and it's not a memory, it's just something we heard?
That can be true, yes. The difference between the sorts of Mandela effects people are noticing is that they're not just hearing it repeatedly. You can say, well, that's what happened, but then why would things change in our physical bodies, like the kidneys themselves be in a different location than where the kidney punch is supposed to be? Like if you've heard of the kidney punch, then in martial arts and boxing, then, or even if you don't do those sports, but you just watch them, you know what that is, that there's a danger if someone is struck in the lower back, and I'm putting my hand in the kidney area where it used to be, but the kidneys aren't there anymore. And so it's kind of interesting when you see things that don't make any sense because they've somehow changed. A lot of people remember geographical changes to history having to do with various events changing. So the fact that the South American continent now looks like it's much farther to the east, for example, than it used to be, so that the time zones are different than some people remember them. That sort of thing is the kind of thing where doesn't make sense that you would have just heard this somewhere. Like, who would be talking about such things? And so for people to collectively be noticing that this is definitely different, it's significant. And so that's where it becomes relevant to study.
I think, something like, oh, the kidneys have changed position. Now, you can't really argue with that if you've got, physicians who say, yes, I can absolutely attest to that. They used to be here and now they're over here. We can't argue with that. How does that happen?
Well, how does the change happen? I
Yeah.
would say consciousness seems, and this is where the theories come in. To me, it looks like consciousness it is fundamental, and it looks like we're experiencing some collective changes across the board to physicality that perhaps initiated first within consciousness, and that's fascinating. I think we need to look at smaller scale studies. It's really hard to study the whole planet at once. And that's where I love the work of Dr. Dean Radin at Institute of Noetic Sciences. And I was fortunate to be part of a scientific study this year. It's called the Sigil experiment, which stands for something which I can't quite remember, but it has to do with using, basically he selected for magicians and meditators to try to influence what was happening inside a literal black box, which was some sort of a physics device similar to the double slit experiment, but not. It's called an interferometer. So inside the little plastic box was just a device that that little photon could interfere with itself. And so 50 participants were selected. I was one of the 50, and I received my box wrapped in copper foil. I know what I'm looking at from my physics background. That's a Faraday cage. So basically, Dr. Dean has created a little plastic box about yay big, and it's wrapped in, looks like copper foil. But to me, I just smiled, like, no problem. We know consciousness can influence the physical world, so I still have the expectation of success to influence. And so it just ran through the 10 different cycles of influencing. 9 went really well. 1, I did something foolish and tried to do advance influence. It's a long story, fascinating. But long story short, what happened with the study, it's now being written up. I've seen the preliminary write-up. Dr. Dean Radin's preliminary write-up rivals what some people would do for a final write-up. So I'm really excited to see his final write-up. But he definitely witnessed that there was influence from the magicians, who are people experienced in influencing external reality, versus the meditators, who mostly work within themselves. And so this sort of small-scale study is going to give us I think the facts, the evidence that people like yourselves would want to see, Sandie and Kingsley. And of course you'd want to see where's the research going? What do we have to show that such a thing is possible? And so stay tuned.
That reminds me of the research that was done with the power of prayer with women, who were having IVF, and it was incredibly successful, except some people actually said they didn't believe it. And that's scientists who had looked at the data and said they couldn't fault the data, but they couldn't believe it. They just could not make that switch, that perceptual shift and believe that something like that should happen. And that's a whole other subject, but we can talk about that. It ties right later.
In with what to me it fits with what Kingsley writes about in the inversion. I would expect people to be going along with that inverted worldview, like, well, this makes no sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's no coincidence that we're seeing more occurrences of people coming forward about the Mandela Effect, because the nature of reality, or the background of nature of reality, is more or less being constant. But why now? Why is this coming forward? And I think that's part of the whole shift we're going through, is that there's an awareness rising up that actually, as you said, reality is more fluid than we've ever acknowledged it to be, or that we've been told it is. And we as human beings are more participatory in the nature of that reality. And so now really the Mandela Effect, it goes back to, as you say, like a belief set. You are more willing and allowing to understand the Mandela Effect if your understanding of reality is more flexible. Now, if you're tied into that main belief set, conditioning of physicality being primary, then you're not really open to the Mandela Effect. So you see the Mandela Effect and all these ideas of this phenomena is like a subgenre underneath the main theme, which is, what is your understanding of the nature of reality? That's the crux. And once that starts to shift, then it has a kind of domino effect. And you start to see that actually all these other sets of phenomena that occur in our conception of reality is more likely and more possible. So if I just quickly jump back to an earlier question from Sandie by saying, who's doing this, who's involved? Well, my understanding is that it's many different participants, and that's the key. Reality is co-participant. Now, if there's a certain section of humanity, let's say, now what I often do is I put forward a hypothesis, and then I test it out as a thought hypothesis. Does that account for certain things we're seeing or not? So let's say one thought hypothesis could be that there's a certain minority or grouping of people on this planet that have a high knowledge of the nature of reality. And they know exactly how reality can be influenced. And they know, of course, therefore, people have more power than we've been told, because individually we can participate in that reality. But if this small group of people want to ensure that reality goes in the direction they want it to go in, and they want to control their version of reality, then they want to keep the majority quite dumbed down, so they're not open to receive other information and to activate their power of participation in that reality. Then you've got a more difficult situation. So I think this rising of what we term anomalies, which really are not anomalies, but they are in this old reality set, it indicates that more and more people are being open to questioning and participating in the nature of the fluidity of reality. And this is what makes this moment in history for humanity so pivotal, because humanity can actually, for the first time in their known history, actually engage in the mechanism of their own evolution, rather than being at the kind of receiving end of evolution, not having no say in it, no participation. So really, I think we're going in a struggle. We're in a struggle or contestation for the future pathway of human evolution, according to how these events and this knowledge unfolds in the coming years.
That's an exciting place to go to break. You're listening to Conversations Beyond the Cutting Edge. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and with me this month are transformational speaker, consciousness researcher, life coach, and best-selling author of Quantum Jumps, Reality Shifts and the Mandela Effect, Cynthia Sue Larson, and sociologist, writer, author, researcher, co-founder of World Shift International, Kingsley Dennis, who's written and published over 24 books, including New Consciousness for a New World, The Inversion, How We've Been Tricked into Perceiving a False Reality. We'll be back with more from Cynthia Sue Larson and Kingsley Dennis after this break. Hello, I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, host of Times flagship radio show, What Is Going On? And as an author, editor and 13 times book judge who's read thousands of books and interviewed hundreds of authors, I'm constantly asked what's really worth reading and what's not. So I created the No BS Spiritual Book Club to help you save time and money by picking the brains of discerning names who have walked this path before you. There's no catch, no fees and no BS, just an ever-growing library of 10 best spiritual book lists from some of your favourite authors and teachers, plus free book excerpts, audios and video interviews with people like Don Miguel Ruiz Jr., David G., Lee Harris, Mark Nepo and more. From well-known classics to hidden gems you've never heard of, it's the only no BS guide to the best spiritual books to enlighten your journey of self-discovery. So why not join the club? Get inspired and save money at the nobsspiritualbookclub.com.
Imagine becoming a super influencer. Reinvent yourself, invest in your brand, and then manifest your success with a robust spheric approach. Times Media and Broadcasting offers a unique and multifaceted way to become the spiritual and conscious influencer you deserve to be by putting your message across our powerful platform with its proven record of integrity and excellence. Through our produced shows, Times offers the opportunity to become a social media TV personality, a radio show host, an Times magazine columnist, and a syndicated podcaster, all in one shot. By live streaming your show on Times TV and broadcasting it across the extensive Times radio and TV networks, you become more than a host. You become an ambassador and a force for positive change. Om Times. Open yourself to the possibilities.
Everything that we do, we can do in a contemplative manner. Through the art of contemplation, you can use the gene keys in a really powerful way. Gene keys is basically the code book of life. In the gene keys, the book is made up of these 3 levels: shadows, gifts, and siddhis. And the journey is through those 3 levels, kind of unpicking of the shadow states, the releasing of the gifts, and then the embodying of this higher consciousness called the siddhi. And the siddhis are very exalted words. And it's not like we kind of suddenly are all these exalted Christ-like beings, but we have flashes and illuminations along the journey. And the more we get stuck into the journey, the more illumination comes to us, because the more we're releasing the light from in these codes inside our DNA. So all those revelations are inside us. So the contemplative way is the inner way.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Welcome back. Cynthia Sue Larson, Kingsley Dennis, can you share some of your personal experiences and reflections and how they relate to the broader themes that we're discussing? What kind of experiences have you had?
I've had some extraordinary experiences through this pandemic period, which involved coming down with what's known as long haul COVID, or PASC as it came to be known. So during that process, it was quite transformative for me personally, because I'm a big believer in the participatory universe that we spoke of previously. That would be John Archibald Wheeler's idea of, if you ask nature a question, nature answers. And I'm a big believer in that, which means that each day I start the day with asking, how good can it get? And I really take that question into my heart, into my being. I pretty much expect and demand to know that I will be shown today how good can it get. And I'm mentioning that because it seems a little bit out of sync or a bit unusual to be simultaneously suffering from hundreds of symptoms and feeling like I'd aged 30 years overnight, but really asking and demanding and expecting to know how good can it get. And absolutely, that is a transformative question. And I can attest to the fact, for at least for myself, I was able to find natural means to recover, to still recovering to full and complete health. Obviously, every organ in my body was impacted by this. And I know some people don't believe in the whole thing. So I was suffering from a chronic disease that people sometimes will be gaslit about. Even doctors will say, that can't be, we don't know what that is. So it was a really interesting experience. And I still feel like the people afflicted by that are my people. I feel like I know what it feels like to go in and have all your medical tests run through and look perfectly normal, yet not be able to stay awake, have dozens of neuropathies and so on and so forth. Anyway, long story short, I was able to recover. I do recognize, as we've been saying, and as I totally believe, consciousness is fundamental. I will run my life that way. I will insist on asking that ridiculously Pollyanna question, how good can it get? It's not because I have not gone through difficult times. No, it's road tested.
It's interesting because, people have different opinions about COVID, and I know many people who saw it as some kind of spiritual experience, because on another level, it made them question so many things. And, it happened to me. I had to question, do I believe that I have the power to have the vaccine that I didn't want to have and not have it affect me in any, negative way at all? And I had to sit and think with that one, because we all think, oh, yes, we're spiritual beings, we're creator beings, we can do this, but we don't know until we're tested. And I think that COVID tested an awful lot of people in many, many different ways. What was your experience, Kingsley?
Well, in the last few years, I think my individual experiences have perhaps been mirrored on a larger scale as well. I think the last few years since 2020 have been phenomenal in this process of shifting perceptions and awakening people. I've had my own intuitions and perceptions for many number of years now, but of course it was a lonelier world out there before. And I think there's certain trigger moments in society that we've been going through, which have been like activation points. And in recent history, we can call 9/11 as one trigger point or activation point, which made people question more things about the nature of reality and the nature of what they've been told, the nature of trust, the nature of human relations, and many more things. In the last few years, my intuition has, I felt more in line with my intuition, and that helped me to step back and see society a bit, more as an observer, and also to make me realize, and just as you brought this up, Sandie, that it's very, very much a spiritual experience that we have to retune with. My sense is that, and this is helping us break from this confinement of the physicality. And my experience also is that my own intuition is sense that actually what we're going through is very much primarily a spiritual contestation. And that we see the physical events happening around the world, and they're very traumatic, and they're despicable. And I call it the theater of the absurd, because what we're seeing is quite absurd. It's inhuman. And also, it makes me realize more that the events behind that, I think, lie primarily more on a spiritual or non-material level, which my own experience in the last few years had made me question the reality of evil. And I think that's quite important to put things in perspective, and also to try to grasp what is the nature of evil. Is it something intrinsically evil in the universe, or in play, in flux, in reality? Or is it a certain type of energy or force which is necessary to provide friction for human evolution? So my experience has been trying to relate and connect and try to comprehend the nature of what I call the entropic forces, or in evolutionary forces, and how they connect with the human condition and what's the influence of that. And I think I personally have seen many evil acts in play across the world coming through humans and their behavior. And the question is, are they acting from themselves or acting from other influences coming through the human body, human being, which again enlarges our conception of reality to incorporate other beings and intelligences. And once you start to enlarge that, you really go down the rabbit hole. But I think it helps you to navigate the world with more resources and more tools also.
Cynthia, do you have anything to
add
to
gosh,
that?
Yes. Oh, I'm so glad, Kingsley. Thank you, Sandie. Yes. Well, this is brilliant that Kingsley brought that up. Thank you, Kingsley, so much for mentioning that, and for your excellent book, The Inversion. All your books are brilliant, but I think this Inversion book is so timely. And in your book, you mentioned some of this concept that this sort of I forget what different people call it, but there are names for it. You mentioned that Carl Jung and Philip K. Dick are aware that there's this sort of interfering element that gets in between humanity and what we might call source. And it seems like it could embody evil, but it seems like it's so present, and it can really get into our daily lives and mess with us. And I was moved by that, because two of the people that you're mentioning in your book, Philip K. Dick and also Carl Jung, those are two individuals that I mention in my book about the Mandela Effect and its society, which is us, we the people. And those are two experiencers, as very early experiencers of reality shifting in front of their eyes. Carl Jung went to Ravenna, Italy. He was observing mosaic tiles that were extraordinary in baptistry. And I describe it in my book, so I'm not going to go into all the detail. But basically, he was there with a friend, Tony Wolfe, and he was talking out loud to her about these baptismal images and water images involving, various people and figures from Christianity. But then later, when he wanted to obtain either go back and see it again or get a postcard or any kind of proof that it existed, it was gone. And so something he'd spent some minutes talking out loud and exclaiming over and committing to his memory regarding the colors and the layout and the size and the nature and the content of each of these mosaics, they were gone. The reason I'm going into some detail is because Carl Jung clearly was noticing a history that no longer existed brilliantly. He is the father of the word synchronicity that he was encouraged to coin by his friend Wolfgang Pauli, the physicist, and the physicist who's quite aware of the effect of consciousness, because Pauli, if he would go into laboratories, the equipment would stop working. So he had a very strong, effect there. And then Philip K. Dick is another experiencer of the Mandela Effect, because he knows what it feels like to go to a room and try to flip the light switch on, and your motor memory doesn't align any longer with the reality you're in. He was obviously an experiencer of this phenomenon. And also these people are extraordinarily important because they both bring up the ideas you're talking about, which I think might have perhaps an earlier form as known as the egregore. So I'm just going to hand it back to Kingsley, because I think you're an expert on this, Kingsley.
I'm an expert on nothing. I appreciate your confidence in me. It's interesting that it's quite serendipitous that we both brought up Jung and K. Dick in our recent work. And I'm particularly drawn to K. Dick because he dealt in popular culture. And generally, we tend to look at the experts or the scientists, the people of academic or research background to give us some indication. And Philip K. Dick often used to say that you could find bits of divine treasure in the garbage dump. That was one of his phrases, by saying, and I think he did very well by putting information into popular culture. And at the time when Dick was writing, the 50s, 60s specifically, he was writing what was known as pulp fiction. So it wasn't really kind of literary, what's seen as literary credibility. Now, Dick is very interesting, and I think he was one of the earliest people that I've come across to actually publicly state that we are living in a matrix simulation. And I think there's a popular video of him from an interview at the science fiction convention in France. I think it's 1976. I think it's the Metz conference.
Yes.
And it is, there he is in a grainy colored kind of handheld video, and he's saying that he feels that all his books are really writing about the same thing, but that what his books have been doing is he's picking up on residual memory from a different timeline, and that residual memory is coming into his book. So when he's writing about different scenarios and different kind of cultures and that, it's not pure fantasy. He says it actually is another timeline. Interestingly, he says, and we can go into this also afterwards because it's very Gnostic and it brings up the demiurge and the egregore. It's a long story, but Dick, I'll make it short. Dick was saying that he felt that there was another reality previously which was more tyrannical than our present society, and he named that the Black Iron Prison. That was his name for it. But he says that somehow humans fought back against that tyranny and they changed the variables of their reality. They changed the variables significantly enough to imprint a different reality, which is our present one. So that means a couple of things. One is that reality is fluid and that it's reliable on certain variables of the program being in place, which means if enough people can change the variables, you can actually shift that reality. And so Dick was actually outlining this, and therefore he said, if we can change the variables of the reality, it makes it seem like a program. Therefore, we have the understanding of a simulation hypothesis. And also it makes sense about the Mandela Effect, means that some of the variables have already been changing, and people are picking that up, the glitches in the program. So Dick is very interesting in that he brought that up in a very kind of casual way without perhaps realizing the import of his insight there.
Yeah, that was just brilliant. And he, the title of it, I believe, was "If you think this world is bad, you should see some of the others."
Yeah.
So it gives us hope that we're not living in the worst possible version of the program, and that it can change. So, however bad the future looks like it can be, it's not written in stone.
Well, tell that to all the people who say, when I leave, I'm not coming back to this planet, I'm going somewhere else.
That's what we say every time we leave.
I'm sure.
We always think, well, I'll give it one last try because maybe I can change it this time around. So we keep coming back. So.
Yeah, do a better job. Maybe I can have those long legs after all. Yeah. So we've only got about 7 or 8 minutes left. A couple of questions. I mean, you have such a wonderful way of titling all of your books. They're all so compelling, the titles and the subtitles, Kingsley. Couple of questions. Who is controlling how we think? And that's the subtitle of one of your books, I know.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not always good on title. I think I go through various variations until I just say, right, that's it. I'll stick with that one. Well, who's controlling? This is the thing is that it's like the Russian doll analogy, the Matryoshka dolls, where you get the Russian doll, you take one off and you got one inside, take one off. So according to our state of perception, we're going to perceive the answer to that differently. So, on one level, are we controlled? Well, of course, because, to live in a society this large, you need social management. You need institutions of control. But of course, we know that if you take it off another doll, that these people or groups in charge of those institutions or responsible for them, they are not in charge to the degree that they may think they are. But there are always forces and influences. So the question is, where does the book stop? And that may be a question we need to get more time to. Maybe we go into the next session, talk about Gnosticism and the demiurge. So where does the book stop? Well, on one level, on a physical level, we have certain groups that want to, through power or greed or control, want to have their version of control of the physical life. So there's a great degree of physical control. But I would say, because we live in a non-material, spiritual, conscious, energetic cosmos, there are also other forces in play, and I think these cosmological, mythological forces. There's some degree of reality to them, and I think we have to engage with that understanding that there are influences that we are not perceiving that are participating through the physical reality, through a different kind of energetic state or dimension.
Mm-hmm. Well, one last question I want you both to address is, where do you think that humanity is heading? Cynthia, would you like to start?
Well, I'm an optimist. I'm the one that keeps asking how good can it get. So obviously, and I keep referencing, we are Homo sapiens, wise humans. We are about to live up to this name, and we're about to bring it to a higher level of conscious agency than we've collectively or individually ever fully known. I mean, we've seen legends representing that. We've seen possibility of quantum superpowers, such as being able to spontaneously heal. These are things that our shamans of the historic, history have definitely had these powers. But now we will have those powers too. Telepathy, bilocation, spontaneous remission of disease, being able to envision that the world could be better, and then seeing that it can be, that we can collectively co-create that we know that consciousness is the primary agency that we have, and really start seeing that in the physical world a great deal more. So this can be a golden age. I see that coming.
Do you think that will happen in our lifetime?
I think some of us are seeing it already. And so it's one of these gradual things. It's like a bell curve. I'm already seeing it. So I'm seeing physiological changes in myself. I splashed boiling water on myself and I didn't even get an impact from it. I'm not getting sunburn from the sun. Things are changing. And so I think if you know that it can happen, you're going to see more of it, obviously. So I think our younger people are going to be the ones that see the most of it. they don't have the same bias instilled in them by our educational systems and all the training that we got that we're the beneficiaries of. So it's good to have the beginner's mind here when you're at a pivotal change point like we are right now.
Kingsley, where do you think we're heading?
Well, I'll concur with Cynthia in that. Likewise, I'm an optimist. I think if to be human, optimism helps. I think humanity is a very noble species, and we haven't yet perhaps fully understood or recognized our nobility. Now, I think where we're going, it is a point of evolution, and which makes me perceive the current events that we're experiencing, as I mentioned, a kind of activation trigger. Because if you need an accelerated moment of development on the evolutionary direction, evolutionary vector, sometimes you need to be squeezed. And I would say that humanity does need to evolve right now, because if not, we could delay or stagnate to some degree. So we may need a bit of an evolutionary trigger point to squeeze us into accessing latent, dormant faculties and organs of perception that haven't activated yet. So I think we are going through a bottleneck, which is necessary on the evolutionary journey to activate latent capacities and organs of perception to take us into a psychic revolution, as Cynthia laid out for humanity.
Well, yeah, and trying to get through any bottleneck is a very painful process.
It is.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Cynthia Sue Larson, Kingsley Dennis, thank you both for joining me today. And I really look forward to seeing you both again in 2 weeks for part 2 of this conversation.
It's a pleasure. See you soon.
So for more information about Cynthia Sue Larson's books, events, Reality Shifts newsletter, and the Mandela Effect, visit realityshifters.com. And to learn more about Kingsley Dennis's books, articles, videos, and podcasts, visit kingsleydennis.com. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer. You can join us for part 2 of this conversation, Beyond the Cutting Edge, on Tuesday, November the 19th at 12 noon Eastern Time. We'll see you then.